McLaren Formula One team. Just over a decade ago, they were capable of winning races and fighting for championships. Now, well, first race of 2023, a double DNF for the team and a car that looks well below par. So we have to ask ourselves, what went wrong and how do we end up here? To really understand what's happened to McLaren and why they've ended up where they are, I think we need to look back to the past, back to 2007, when they were successful and they were capable of winning races. Because I think to understand why they are in the position they are now, we have to understand the origins of their downfall. And I think in their successful years, we can see where the cracks really start to show. So in this video, I will cover a 5-year period from 2007 to 2012 to understand exactly where things started to go wrong for them. Without further ado, let's get into it. So 2007 brought a new set of regulations to the sport. And on top of that, McLaren brought in 2 new drivers, reigning 2-time world champion Fernando Alonso and hotshot rookie Lewis Hamilton, which, in retrospect, probably one of the best driver lineup we have seen in our generation. Testing looked good for McLaren. Ferrari and McLaren were looking to be the main contenders, and as expected when the season started, Ferrari and McLaren traded wins. Over at McLaren, what no one could have expected was not only the pace, but the consistency of rookie Lewis Hamilton, who got 9 podiums in his first 9 races, which, on a side note, is just insanely impressive. I think that is ridiculous, but besides the point, what this led to was a championship battle really between Hamilton and Alonso. Obviously the Ferraris were there or thereabouts, but really it was those two. And as this battle started to heat up, things began to fracture a little bit. Canada. Alonso has a bit of a rough race. He tries to overtake Lewis around the outside in turn 1, lap 1, runs wide, doesn't quite work out for him, has brake problems throughout the race, and Lewis takes his first win of the season. Indianapolis, Hamilton and Alonso in a straight fight for the win, and Hamilton comes out on top, and Alonso shows his frustration with the team by shaking his fist at the pit wall as he drives by. Then in Hungary, in Q3, Alonso blocks Hamilton, preventing him from getting his final lap in, which he could qualify for pole. Why? Because Lewis Hamilton didn't give him track position as agreed before qualifying during the final bit of qualifying. It was a bit of revenge that cost Alonso 5 positions on the grid the next day. To make matters worse, on the morning of the Grand Prix, Fernando Alonso and Ron Dennis were seen arguing. Now, at the time, there was lots of speculation about what this could be about, but McLaren were under investigation at the time. And it turns out it was about probably the biggest sporting scandal in Formula One history. And that was Spygate. Now, there are a million YouTube videos out there about what Spygate is, but to summarize, McLaren were caught handling hundreds of pages of classified documents from Ferrari, which they got from disgruntled employee Nigel Stepney. McLaren essentially got kicked out of the Constructors' Championship and fined $100 million, which is the largest fine in Formula One history. It's an obscene fine, and it really was crucial in the future. Now, why were Alonso and Ron Dennis arguing? Well, Alonso wanted Hamilton to be run out of fuel during the race as sort of revenge for everything that's happened. And he threatened to leak the emails exposing the fact that the team knew about Spygate and they had all those documents. Now, this was sort of the pinnacle intentions really throughout the season, and it really was a dark mark on what was a very successful season for McLaren. Throughout the rest of the year, McLaren and Ferrari continued to duke it out for the championship. The tension continued and the on-track battles continued. In the end, neither McLaren won the world title. We're losing out to Kimi Räikkönen in the last race by just 1 point, the pair of them. I think McLaren really cost Lewis the title here. In China, they left Hamilton out on ruined intermediate tyres, which meant he slid wide while entering the pits and ended up in the gravel trap and cost him the win and the championship. And then in Brazil, he still could have won the championship quite easily, but he had a gearbox problem a few laps in that sent him to the back, and he only managed to get back up to 7th after that. And that wasn't enough, and Raikkonen won. I think that's really a theme that we'll see throughout the rest of the video, is McLaren making a lot of mistakes and a lot of errors and not operationally being right there. And I think as well, what we can see from the whole Alonso and Ron Dennis dispute, there was a clear mismanagement of drivers, which came from the top, which Ron Dennis was. He was the head of McLaren at the time. And he may have made the team great, but his ego and his pride were very, very high, much like Alonso, which is why they clashed so badly. And I think Ron Dennis's pride had a tendency of getting the better of him. And some say as well, this is why the fine was so large, the 100 million, because Max Mosley, the head of the FIA at the time, thought he wasn't a great person. I'm going to not say what he said. So at the end of the year, Alonso left. Lewis Hamilton stayed, and they brought in Heikki Kovalainen. And in 2008, it was fine. They got it right. Lewis Hamilton ended up winning the World Championship by 1 point, one of the most dramatic finales until 2021 that we've ever seen, with Lewis Hamilton overtaking Timo Glock on the last corner of the last lap to get into position to win the championship. Felipe Massa was world champion for 36 seconds. And I think we've all seen the video. Is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly? Oh my goodness me. Incredible. But Spygate, did anything happen with it? Like, it seems like they got away with it, right? With them winning the championship 2008. Even though they didn't win the constructors, they still won the drivers. Well, no. 2009 brought another regulation change, which McLaren got wrong. At least at the start of the season, they got it wrong. They weren't very quick. Hamilton wasn't capable of fighting for wins at the start of the season. They got better as the season progressed, but it was clear to see they just didn't get it right. The big story that year was the emergence of Brawn GP with their innovative double diffuser, which led to them winning the championship, both constructors and drivers, with Jenson Button. Now, the reason this is so important in this story is that Mercedes was McLaren's engine partner, and as a result, they had to pay 40% of the fine for Spygate. That's 40 million. As you might imagine, Mercedes lost a little bit of faith with McLaren at this point because, that's a huge fine, and they were just like, why would we put this much money in when we can maybe have our own team? Brawn GP, sparring towards financial collapse, was a very good option for them to pursue their own Formula One interests. So, as a result, they bought Brawn and ended the sport in 2010. So for McLaren, that meant they were no longer the sole focus of Mercedes. And although they maintained their work status at the time, it was very much a sign that things were shifting away from McLaren. Now, in 2010, it was still successful for McLaren. They brought in Jenson Button from Brawn, and they had alongside Lewis Hamilton. Now, both drivers performed well, providing the points, and McLaren providing a good enough car to fight for the championship. But I mean, you could say this about all the teams, but for McLaren, mistakes started to creep in again. Malaysia, in the wet in qualifying, the team relies on their radar a little bit too much, and Lewis goes out in Q1. Monaco, Button retires due to an overheating engine, due to a human error leaving a bung in the air intake. Hungary, a gearbox problem for Lewis. The drivers were far from flawless, but there were still mistakes creeping in there that were costing the drivers crucial points, and in the end, neither driver could win the Drivers' Championship, and McLaren could win the Constructors either. 2011 was the year of Red Bull domination. Not much McLaren could do, but they had the car there or thereabouts, but it just wasn't as good as Red Bull. However, again, despite this, there still were more errors. Turkey, a poor pit stop for Lewis and a terrible strategy for Jenson cost them crucial points. Silverstone, a botched pit stop led to Jenson retiring because his wheel nut wasn't fastened. Germany, a hydraulics failure for Jenson. Japan, a Lewis slow pit stop. Although admittedly, that was partially his own fault. He had a puncture from collision with Massa. And in Abu Dhabi, we see that Jenson lost KERS, which is the precursor to RS we see today. So again, more and more operational problems and unreliability that's just keeps costing little points, even though, they had no chance of beating Red Bull. Still those little bits there. 2012 was really the season that I think was the worst for McLaren operationally and with reliability. The car was very quick. The car was, in my opinion, having watched the season, possibly the quickest car overall throughout the season. I think at the start, they were definitely the quickest. In the middle, maybe they were a little bit not. Then at the end, I think they had a good pace again. But I think Red Bull and Ferrari had caught up by that point. But they didn't challenge for the championships, either of them. Vettel and Alonso became the main protagonists of that championship battle. And to talk about the errors that were happening this season, Australia, they won, but they miscalculated Jenson Button's fuel in their car and had to go into massive fuel saving. In Spain, similar deal. In qualifying, they underfueled Lewis and he couldn't give a fuel sample, which meant he got disqualified from qualifying, and he got pole as well. He could only get it back up to 8th. That's a lot of points lost there. Canada, strategy error in qualifying left Button qualifying P10. Valencia, botched pit stop for Lewis. He ended up crashing in that race later on because he was battling hard to make up for it. Then later on in the season, Singapore and Abu Dhabi, Hamilton retires from the lead. And if you look at it that way, he's probably lost about 70 points just from McLaren making mistakes, possibly even more. And I know other drivers got unlucky, but the point has to be made. He could have been in the championship fight. He finished 91 points off the championship lead. And it was a throw by McLaren to not have at least one of their drivers in the fight. And in the end, they finished third in the constructors, behind Ferrari, who at the start of the season looked terrible and off the pace. So why have I talked about all this? How is all this relevant to their downfall? Well, I think what we need to see here is that they really created their own downfall, and there were so many cracks at this point starting to show that really grew over time. I think, we can see, Spygate, for example. Ron Dennis making it worse by being such a polarizing character, especially with Max Mosley at the time, meant that their fine was probably bigger than it otherwise might have been. And that fine being so big meant that Mercedes lost faith in McLaren and started to make their own F1 team. Now, McLaren making all these operational mistakes, it meant Lewis Hamilton lost faith in the team. There's an iconic shot of him walking away from the car in 2012 in Singapore, and a lot of people point to that as the moment he decided to leave McLaren and join. Guess who? Mercedes. At the time, that was like poaching their star driver and putting him into a midfield team. That's how much he lost faith in McLaren. And Jeremy Clarkson said at the time, isn't that like moving from Manchester United to West Ham? Well, the rest is history. I think on top of that as well, Hamilton has since commented on the media commitments for McLaren being a lot at the time, and he didn't really have the freedom to express himself and do what he wanted, which is something we can see he has at Mercedes a lot more. And again, I think this was, again, a bit of a Ron Dennis sort of influence, very tight ship he ran, very strict. So I think what we can see is just all the ingredients of mismanagement from Dennis and the errors and all these things that led to the factors that contribute to their downfall. It's a sad tale, but I think we can really start to see the origins of their downfall. These years were way more successful than the years where they were to come, but we'll talk about those years in the next video in part 2, where we'll cover 2013 to 17 through what probably is the worst period in their recent history. So thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, and cheers.